Thanks, Patricia. Hi, everybody. This is Vicki Ibanez from Redwin Consulting. Welcome to our webinar today. Redwin is a national tribal technical assistance provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women, and specifically through this project, we are providing technical assistance to transitional housing programs, tribal transitional housing programs. Redwin's vision is to strengthen tribal programs and Native organizations' ability to develop and enhance local responses to address and prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. In this effort, Redwin is committed to building the leadership of Indigenous women, defining and guiding its work from traditions and values that carry the strength and essence of Native women while recognizing that we must work across our community to bring everyone back into the circle of life. For today's training, we have Karen Artichoker from the Indigenous Women's Justice Institute. The topic is substance use and domestic violence policy. I'm reading the wrong one. Sorry about that. Substance use and domestic violence, working with victims. Karen Artichoker is an enrolled member, citizen of the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota. She has a work history of developing resources, programs, and strategies in response to violence against women and children. She has worked on a local, tribal, statewide, and national level, advocating and working to implement strategies to stop violence against Native women. She is a founding mother of Sacred Circle, National Resource Center to End Violence Against Native Women. In addition to working in the area of domestic violence and sexual assault, Karen also has experience working in the fields of mental health and substance abuse. She is a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother, and lives in Rapid City, South Dakota. And we're really pleased to have her here today because she has a wealth of knowledge that she's going to share with you. And just before I turn it over to her, I just want to say for participants that have multiple people in the room, there's a webinar sign-in sheet on the lower part of the screen. And if you can download that and sign that in, and it has instructions to either fax or email it back to Redwin so we can provide accurate reporting to the Office on Violence Against Women. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this webinar over to Karen Artichoker. Karen?
Okay, thank you so much, Vicki, and I want to thank Redwin Consulting. I'm really honored to have been asked to present today. And I'll start with saying, Chante Vashte Nape Chuzape, that I'd like to extend a heartfelt handshake to each of you. I'm kind of old school, so I miss seeing each of your faces and being able, I think my jokes might fall flat, especially if we can't use our body language or eye contact, but we're going to do our best here today to maybe have some interactions that will be helpful to you. I have to say I come with more questions than I do answers. So I don't consider myself necessarily an expert, but I have had, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting journey for me to have had some experience after making a career in ending violence against Native women to kind of fall back on my mental health and substance abuse background and see some of the strides that have been made in those fields over the years. So we'll see what we can do today. I'm hoping that, I'm sure there's many of you that are probably more knowledgeable in some or all of these areas that I'm going to be covering. And I know that Vicki's going to be taking questions, and so people, please feel free to jump in. So we're talking about transitional housing, and I'm aware that there's certainly different types of models. There's rent structures. There's some programs where people are scattered throughout a city, some that maybe are living in one big house. But whatever the model, we know that our mission, right, the process that we're looking for is to assist someone in making that transition from being a victim to a survivor. And I noticed that those words have been used, are starting to be used interchangeably, I suppose in recognition that It's not like you're a victim one day and a survivor the next. But it is a process, and it's often a long journey. It requires a lot of support, and certainly that's our forte as Indigenous women. So I'm confident that we're going to be doing some great work here. We know there's ongoing safety issues that the women that are participating in your program, we know they're going to have ongoing safety issues. Again, she's not just a victim one day and then she gets into transitional housing, from the shelter or however your model is working, and she's suddenly safe. It just doesn't work like that, and we all know that. There's other issues, poverty. Of course, she's coping with her children, the impact that violence has had on her children. Many, many women we know, the reality is that there's been a whole lifetime of violence occurred from infancy to the present time. And we also know that many women will have substance abuse, use or dependency issues, mental health issues. Maybe, there's a weak kinship network. Unfortunately, we know that's true. So we want to take a look quickly at how we got here, because it can lay the foundation for creating strategies, for helping us to problem solve, for taking a look at, where some of the strengths are, what's going on so that we can formulate something powerful. We know that both of these issues, violence and substance dependency, they're relatively new problems in our community. And we know that we do have a unique history as tribal peoples. I don't know how many of the programs employ non-Native advocates. So whether we're Native or non-Native, we have a responsibility to understand our history, because it's helpful for us then to understand where the women participating in our programs are at. And for many of us, it facilitates a healing journey for ourselves also. So, the big first one was alcohol. And we know that alcohol was used as a weapon of war. It was used to gain the upper hand in dealings with Indigenous people. And we know that most of our tribes, we had no experience, or we had no social mores to define any kind of drinking behavior. So it was used to exploit us. And when you look at, there's written history on this. Here's Catlin, of course, who was very famous. Every kind of access is studiously avoided, that we were a people of balance, There were no beggars, no drunkards, that we were a healthy people, and that we enjoyed life, Here's a Reverend Moses Merrill in 1837. So you can see we're going a ways back here. And again, the exploitation of Native people, that within a 5-year period, there's a tribe totally averse to drinking whiskey, and they sweetened it, induced them to drink, and they're now a tribe of drunkards. So we know that initially this use of alcohol as a weapon of war was about economics. It was about the economic relationship, and so when you start to look at some of the federal Indian policy, you can see some of that policy actually was about trade and intercourse. We're looking at 1790 there. Just some little historical tidbits. In 1924, we became citizens. In 1952, we could legally drink. So, you look at, 50-some years, we have a call to action from the CDC and IHS that a survey of death records between 2001 and 2005 revealed that 11.7% of Native deaths were alcohol-related, compared to 3.3%. So for some of us that have been working in the field for numbers of years, we know that, and I used to say it too, that, wow, if we could just stop alcohol, we would, we would be perfect. We all knew that for many, many years alcohol has been problematic in our communities. And now it seems like over time, we've got, there's been more drugs added to the scene. And alcohol is a drug. It's a legal drug. And we have many illegal drugs. And if you look on this list, many of these also can be obtained by prescription. So many are legal drugs, and we seem to be adding more and more. Of course, cannabis, that's a big one. And, I know there's some medical benefits. I also know that in doing many, many drug and alcohol assessments, and whether it was in the alcohol unit or the methamphetamine inpatient unit, we saw that history, the gateway drugs, we saw the use of alcohol, cannabis. You could just see marching through time. So, I'm sitting with somebody who's in their 40s, and they have a drug history going back from the age of 6, and you can just, and it probably it's very sad. Some use every drug imaginable. So we're looking at cannabis, cocaine. I think in some communities, that's still strong. In others, it's ebbing a little, getting edged out by methamphetamine, heroin, those types of drugs. Of course, the opioids, the hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, heroin, codeine, and of course we know that IHS has been prescribing those, and I know they've been trying to figure out how to respond, probably not quickly enough or strongly enough, but because we know that created a lot of addicts. Amphetamines, many of these drugs are used to treat ADHD. Benzodrine, Adderall, of course you have MDMA, ecstasy, meth. These are nervous system stimulants. And of course meth is a real biggie now in many communities. And we know, well, I'm going to say I was the director at White Buffalo Calf, in the early 90s. And we had folks caution us about the Mexican cartel and hooking up with Native women to infiltrate communities and introduce drugs into the community. And we certainly know that, we see many, many tribal communities now where that is a major problem, and tribes are struggling to try to address that in multitudes of ways. Excuse me. So that's a biggie, and we do know that it does increase aggression. Many of these drugs do, so we're seeing those increases in violence. So we used to say, and we still do, alcohol and drugs don't necessarily cause a person to become violent, but now we know now we know more and more about these drugs that they certainly do lend themselves to violence. The benzos, benzodiazepines, the diazepam, Xanax, Librium, clonazepam, lorazepam, we're seeing those, pretty prescribed in tribal communities with the high levels of anxiety and depression. We have the synthetics, K2 or Spice, bath salts, Flakka, and there's so many new street names coming. Even with alcohol, there's so many. We have Mike's Hard Lemonade. Good heavens, certainly not when some of you who may be my age that, the array and menu for alcohol certainly wasn't as broad as it is today. UV, blue, and pink. And so, they're just really out there, and our children and communities are very, very vulnerable. And then certainly we see the over-the-counter remedies that are being used, the cough syrups, Benadryl. Not that long ago, I was in the emergency room with a 15-year-old who'd had, she took a couple hundred Benadryl and was totally out of it and had to be flown out. And she survived. but Benadryl was what was popular in her circle. There's some other drugs that have proven to be demonstrated to be effective in reducing at least alcohol and opioid use. Naltrexone, Vivitrol, it's a once-monthly extended-release injectable, and we're seeing it's starting to be tried in some areas around us here on the plains. I know in Wyoming they're trying it. I talked with the sheriff there, and they had 50 doses. They were using it on young people in jail. And they'd interviewed a young man who was 21. I believe he'd been drinking daily since the age of 13, and was using on Vivitrol, and just reported what a relief it was to not have those cravings. Just excuse me, and that hopefully within a month, that injectable is once a month. They were hoping that people could get into a recovery plan because they had a limited amount and it was quite expensive. We know that there's been a lot of heroin overdose in our communities. Naloxone, that's effective February 8th this year. IHS pharmacies started to provide naloxone to BIA law enforcement officers, and who are supposed to be getting trained up to administer it and carry it with them. Whether that's occurred or not, I couldn't tell you, but I'm certainly going to be looking into that more. And I'd like to know exactly where that's available. So if you look at substance use, misuse, abuse, dependency, probably most of us have abused or misused substances. We've drank too much, experimented with whatever drug. Some of you out there may be in recovery. I certainly recommend that anytime we're working in a program where we're working with women who are in danger, I personally recommend abstinence for people, just because I think that, one, if people are looking at us as role models, that we need to be able to say that, one, we can safeguard their information, no loose lips here, and the other thing is that I think that when people have a problem, it's pretty hard for us to talk to them about having the problem if they see us as using also. And maybe in some of your communities it's different, where you can be a social drinker. But in our communities, if someone is using, then people don't typically look to that as a social kind of thing. So I don't know. I'll get off my little soapbox there. That's just kind of my personal thing. But that's my recommendation. And I don't want to be judgmental about anyone's use either. That's all personal. But when you look at the DSM-5, and substance use has gone through some reorganization now, and it's come out in the last couple of years now with the new DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that substance use really is being classified as a brain disorder, and that it's now being placed on a continuum from mild to severe. So when you're doing an assessment, and some of you who are drug and alcohol background, counseling background out there, you know that when we do an assessment, we're looking at the impact of use on different areas of people's being. So your physical health, your emotional health, your psychological health, your housing, your ability to maintain employment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how much the use of each individual drug has impaired your ability to function in life. And so, again, for some people who are social drinkers, like I've told lots of people, if you have a glass of wine with your meal, that's your business. And as long as you're not ending up in some sort of, losing your job, you're not in conflict with your children or your family over your use. Maybe there's moments when you've abused it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have a major problem. So the new criteria, which is overarching for each drug, really looks like is there a sort of a clinical impairment that's occurring to determine whether or not there's mild, moderate, or severe dependence. Okay, so let's kind of segue now because we're talking about violence and we're talking about substance abuse hand in hand here. So let's move over into talking about domestic violence, and we're talking about, well, actually, we could be talking about heterosexual male, female, intimate partner, whatever you want to call it nowadays. That couple, we probably actually could just still talk about it in terms of the tiwahe, or the nuclear family and extended family also. But we know that in our tribal cultures that we had a sacred status as nurturers. We begin in water, and then as female people, we our children are nurtured in that water and then come to this world. So water is life, and that those are responsibilities as women. We were respected, huh? And so domestic violence, like substance abuse, was not a major problem for us. Certainly, we hear of isolated instances. We know that, for instance, we have a story about the first battered women's shelter, and the Wolf Nation were the first advocates. And the woman who made the mistake of going to live with her partner's people, she ran away. The Wolf Nation found her, and they kept her safe through the winter. And then they helped her get home to her people in the spring. So, we know it occurred. But we also know that it wasn't such a big problem that we're seeing today, and we know that it was dealt with very harshly and severely. So, we didn't live in utopia, but we certainly we had our problems, but we know that we dealt with things. Huh? We'll cruise through these statistics. Of course, this is the most recent survey. When you look at this stats, 84.3% of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. American Indian, Alaska Native women 2 times more likely to experience rape or sexual assault crimes compared to other races. 61% women have been assaulted. 56% experience sexual assault. 55.5%. Oh, that has interesting. Have experienced violence by an intimate partner. I don't know what happened to all my slides. Maybe somebody decided there was too many of them there because they're pretty tough pill to swallow. The other interesting thing that came out of that survey from the National Institute of Justice, that, by the way, took us about a decade to get that baseline survey, and we actually had to legislate it, was that 46% of residents on reservations were non-native. So maybe some of you are living on reservations that are pretty homogeneous, like myself. I'm from the Pine Ridge. That figure's not going to be that high, but for many tribes that are located in much closer to urban areas, or, we know that that's reality also. So that statistic about non-Indian assaults against Native women has proven to be true, although, again, we know that for many of our tribal communities, we see lots and lots of Native violence. Okay. So I don't know if I'm still riveting. There's no questions coming in here, but now feel free again to go ahead and post your questions, or and Vicki will let me know, or we can stop and take questions. We'll also be taking some questions at the end of the presentation. Okay. So when we look at those statistics on domestic violence, and I'm assuming that all of you have had some sort of background in training and advocacy, working with transitional housing programs, that and we look at the use of substance abuse, that we can agree that many of the participants will have experienced substance abuse or dependence and violence in their family of origin, kinship network, or community. I don't think there's too many of us that can say that we've escaped that, whether it's, in our own family, our extended family network, or if we escape the violence and substance use in our communities. Bruce Perry, I just really admire this guy. He's this quote from him: "The brains of traumatized children develop as if the entire world is chaotic, unpredictable, violent, frightening, and devoid of nurturance." More and more we're finding that while there is a genetic predisposition, it's not a predetermination, and that really environment is very, very crucial in helping to determine whether we as human beings, what kind of life we're going to have. Okay? And we know that in our communities, many of us have experienced that chaos, unpredictability, that violence, that very frightening world. Mental health, I know you're going to be are seeing women and children who have mental health issues, depression. And depression, I want to say that all of these things, they're normal. Depression, anxiety, they're normal. We all have them. And some of us, if we haven't been diagnosed, if we went to see a mental health professional, maybe we would be diagnosed. So a degree of this is normal. We're looking at, again, clinical impairment. So if we have major depression, dysthymia, which is kind of a persistent, ongoing depression, and if you look at the again, the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual, some of those definitions or the symptomology, you're going to see it's persistent, gloomy, constantly complaining, not really having any fun, not being fun or not able to have fun. I mean, it makes you wonder about, the receptionist at the tribal office, that when you call and she says, "What do you want?" Or we see a lot of the really flat affect where you sound pretty emotionless, Anxiety, it's a normal feeling. There's generalized anxiety, panic disorder, phobias. I saw one study where I think that was in Albuquerque at the Indian Health Service Hospital a number of years back. There was a study showing really, you were talking about battered women, lots of panic disorder. Okay? And, of course, psychotic disorders. I've seen that probably more with rape victims than domestic violence, but certainly we see some psychosis at times. Comorbidity. This is when two disorders or illnesses occur simultaneously in the same person. So just in the general population, as many as 6 in 10 people who have a substance abuse disorder also suffer from mental illness. Okay. Doesn't mean that one caused the other, even if one might have appeared first. So we're looking at some self-medicating. Sometimes, a mental illness may be showing and may be occurring, and people are using alcohol or other drugs to self-medicate. Sometimes people get involved with alcohol and other drugs, and maybe some trauma that comes with that kind of lifestyle, or it might just trigger something where people will end up with both problems. So again, I kind of spoke briefly to this, that there's overlapping genetic vulnerabilities. There's a predisposition. Now we're seeing some intergenerational evidence. of that intergenerational memory. But again, a predisposition does not mean a predetermination. And that was an important distinction for me, because I remember when it came out years ago, they started talking, this is genetic. And I'm like, well, what? So are we flawed or what? How come we, all these years ago, back in the time of our ancestors, we just always had this gene. But now what we're saying is that a predisposition doesn't necessarily predetermine. So we have these environmental triggers, stress, trauma, abuse, early exposure to drugs and alcohol, which we see, at least in the work I've done in the alcohol and drug field, you see a very early start date. And the earlier, the greater the risk, I guess, or the greater difficulty, I believe, in recovery. We see that there's an involvement of similar brain regions. So again, more and more a body of science coming out about how injurious it is to the brain for with alcohol and drugs or for trauma. So alcohol and drugs, they move to the reward processing centers of the brain, Talking about how we shouldn't call it addiction, it should be more about reward seeking, or if you're looking for, if there's any kind of addiction, it's about wanting that reward, those pleasure centers. Just like the 12-year-old who used meth, telling me that she said, it'll take you to God, you'll find God, she said. So we know that trauma, again, it can affect those frontal lobes with executive decision making. So we know decision making is impaired. Of course, a long time ago we called these things shell shock. I thought that was actually a pretty good description, because you can become very numb, and it's like the world's going around and you're like, what? Okay, so drug abuse and mental illness are actually developmental disorders. They often begin in adolescence and even childhood, and this is when the brain is really growing, So early exposure to drugs can change the brain in ways that increase the risk for mental illness, just as early symptoms of mental disorder may increase vulnerability to drug abuse. Okay. I'm guessing, and I've seen some information showing that upwards of 50% of women in shelter have substance use or dependence issues. I know I was doing the support group a few years back, and while I was working on the methamphetamine inpatient unit, and when I said this is my day job, and I think there was about 7 women sitting there, and 2 of them raised their hands. Said, I have that problem. What do I do? What shall I do? And I had 2 other women come to me after that group to talk about wanting to go to AA meetings, or that they were alcoholics. There's some distinct forms of trauma that we have as Native people. Of course, we have our cultural trauma, the tremendous loss of our languages, our practices, our rituals, how our ancestors lived in the world that gave our tribes balance. So we do see some, many of us finding the universality in values and practices. Many of us who have lost some customs or practices in our own families or our tribes, gravitating to other tribes, or looking at other ways that we can find some balance. Historical trauma, that's individual exposure. Many of us that had, lost relatives at Wounded Knee, the cultural destruction, and I always say when I look at an individual battering experience, and I hate to call it an experience, but an assault, and I look at Wounded Knee, the cavalry, they were drunk. They destroyed women's property. They said, we'll chase you across the prairies till we catch you and kill you. I mean, all things that we hear individual batterers say to women. So we can see the connection between our history and that trauma and then what's happening in our families today. Discrimination and poverty, if you look at ACES, the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey, they had 10 areas to sort of see how, what your level of trauma was, I guess. And I've seen one survey now that was administered on a reservation, and they added poverty, discrimination, and the other thing that stood out as being traumatic for children was domestic violence. So we know that poverty is traumatizing. Okay, discrimination, when we had our children from American Horse School in Allen on the Pine Ridge go to Rapid City and have beer poured on them at the hockey game by drunken attendees there, along with racial epithets. I mean, that was traumatizing for those children. Okay. Intergenerational trauma, this is a cumulative exposure of traumatic events that affects us as individuals. So we have distinct forms of trauma, and we need to think about that as we're formulating strategies and programs, this history and what we've experienced. But I hope we can agree that most of the participants in your programs will have children, that some will lack education, employment, or employable skills. Some will have experienced traumatic events throughout their lives. Some will have grown up in families or kinship networks where alcohol and drug use is rampant. Some will have experienced poverty, discrimination, witnessed violence. Some will maybe have gone to treatment, substance abuse treatment. Some may be in counseling or involved in a mental health system. Some may have thought about or attempted suicide. Some may be using alcohol or other drugs to self-medicate, and now that has become a problem on its own. Some may lack basic life and social skills. Fear of being alone, I actually added this one on my own because I wasn't seeing it a lot in some of the literature documents I was reviewing. Maybe I'm wrong, but I hear that over and over and over from there are no young women that I advocate for, by and with, and I hear them express these fears about being alone, which makes them very, very vulnerable to exploitation and violence, future violence. Many may not have cultural information or knowledge, but they want to learn. Some may have cultural knowledge and access to culture and spirituality. I remember calling up one young woman, and I told her that part of the program that we would be offering our sweat lodge, and for women. And she was just quiet. Finally, we're like, "Hello," and she says, "Can you do that? Could you teach me?" She said, all my family, she said, there's not one person that can tell me anything about that, and I really want to know. I believe that's what's going to save my family, she says. So we have to remember that people have varying degrees of involvement or knowledge or even access to our cultures, our various tribal cultures. We know that, again, there's a fine line between being victim and survivor, and that she may have ongoing safety issues. Does she feel safe? Is her substance use interfering with her ability to keep herself and her children safe? I'm sure there's many, many more questions, and I'm sure that there's many, tools that you use in evaluating safety and helping a woman evaluate her own safety. So I guess, one of the goals for an organization or for us as individuals is to become more trauma-informed, so that, knowing that a person has has or potentially has these substance use dependence issues, has experienced violence, has been victimized by violence, many even from childhood on, trying to parent children, trying to, make our way in the world, that we need to become trauma-informed. This is really, I think, a much-needed and welcome addition to the field that we've been working in for all these years. Okay. A recognition, so trauma-informed care means that we have a recognition that there's a high prevalence of trauma. We recognize that there's primary and co-occurring issues, and these issues do not subside overnight, that we want to assess for traumatic histories and symptoms, and the way that we do that, and we want to be respectful, so we want to do that in a respectful way, and that's about making a relationship. So I want to just put it out there that, again, to think about your age. I found, this has been my career since my 20s, and I found that as I've aged now that, of course, the women in the shelter or whoever I'm working with, they're younger than I am. And so I become an auntie or even a grandmother figure. That kind of relationship creates kind of a different way that we relate to each other. And maybe I can say a few things in a gentle way, that gentle Unchi grandma way, that I couldn't say to her if I were her peer. So I would recommend you really think about your age and what that means in terms of the relationship. We want to recognize practices that are re-traumatizing. Power and control is minimized, so that's about, again, how we behave, our tone of voice, the look on our face, because we know that with these mental health and substance abuse issues that there's kind of a hypersensitivity or hypervigilance that people have. Focus on collaboration, training needs. We understand that, whatever behavior, it's become a coping adaptation, and we don't need to personalize it. It's not about us. Objective language, labeling, and we want a transparent system so that it helps people to feel safer. And we do need to presume that the people, this is clients we serve, I say relatives, have a history of traumatic stress, and we want to exercise universal precautions. We want to be trauma-informed. It's the respectful way to be. Barriers. Healthcare systems are typically disconnected. Physicians treat mental illness, and while there's a mix of providers delivering substance abuse treatment. Okay. Some substance abuse providers may be biased against the use of medication. And there's just in general a stigma attached to relatives who've been victimized or who have these issues. And I do want to say, I use the word relatives here. I worked at a children's mental health program most recently, and we did not use the word clients. We used the word relative because we were trying to create an environment where, again, it's about those relationships, and that this isn't about, we're the helper and you're the helpee. This is about us as Indigenous people moving together, working together to try to create a safer, more quality community and home environment for children. Other barriers, I'm sure I'm not telling any of you anything new. Lack of family or community support, that's a big one. Identity confusion or self-hatred, I've seen that a lot, even in communities where there's, I think, there's a lot of access to cultural and spiritual information if you know how to get to it. There's a lack of cultural knowledge. There's a lot of identity confusion. And we know that recovery from alcohol and drug dependence, those are very key, and that is evidence-based now. Spiritual emotional dysregulation, just not appropriate, and a lot of times go off really easily. Those are the women that they get called difficult, whatever labels are attached. But this dysregulation, inability to regulate your emotions, lack of coping skills, life skills, social skills. There's a lot of that, could be, it could be related to poverty. It could be related to, those family of origin issues and poverty. Like our washers always get overloaded, right, and whatnot. Parenting skills, poverty, discrimination, ongoing safety issues, language, lack of formal education, transportation. Again, there's probably other barriers that you're well-versed in, whether there's involvement in the criminal justice system or social services systems. We haven't even gone there. This was just looking at more of the individual. Wonderful protective factors that we have are cultural identity, our familial relationships, education. Employment is a protective factor. Education, even for young people, in that ACEs survey, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, showed that education, school was a protective factor. The youth that were in school were doing much better, even if they were having a tough life. They were doing better than the youth who dropped out. Community health and support, and schools. So again, I want to say that that cultural identity, familial relationships. Maybe there are women participating in your program that don't have a lot of strong family support. So we see a lot of surrogate family, or we want to try to encourage making that surrogate family. And certainly, you want to become that sister, auntie, grandma, whatever to this woman and her children, because that could be a real strength for her in finding her way as she transitions. Again, here's a quote from talking about how in the Western mental health profession there's just these clinical concerns with distress and how you move more toward wellness. For us as Native, tribal, obviously this is from Canada using the word Aboriginal, there's an identification, cultural reclamation, and spiritual well-being, purposeful living. Those can be very powerful forces in helping us to become healthy again. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that, everybody's got to sundance or carry a pipe or whatever your particular tribal teachings are about spirituality. I'm not saying that, we all have to, hunt buffalo again or whatever, but we're talking about that no educational process is unbiased. Pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire, right? That we have the right to talk about what's important to us as tribal people, and we have the right to educate our people about what those rights and responsibilities are as tribal indigenous people. So anyway, when a woman comes to your program, I would hope that your program has been designed to support her, okay, in not just maintaining, because it's probably more about obtaining autonomy, sovereignty, and ultimately permanent housing. So hopefully the program policies, the program requirements, they're balanced, they're in alignment. And it kind of makes me feel badly that I need to say about first impressions and being hospitable, that katiopa, where somebody comes to your door and you're a gracious hostess. But unfortunately, I've seen some of our folks forgetting how important that is to make somebody feel comfortable, to offer them a cup of coffee, or I was always taught if you don't have If it's not a full meal, it's a sandwich. If you don't have that, it's a cup of coffee, a glass of water, to help her feel welcome. And, of course, I'm assuming that many of you will already have had contact with the women in your program. But I think, again, we can role model that generosity of being a host in a home. I'm always concerned about the paperwork that our programs are doing. Of course, there's some things that you have to keep, that's things that are required by funders. What's confidential, what isn't, what information you need. But why is that information needed? Let her know why you need to keep it. Does it serve her interests, and does it keep her safe? Because remember, that paperwork is going to follow her for a very long time. So the questions asked should have a reason and a purpose. And then remember, too, that even though maybe she's not been physically assaulted for a while, that she still has experienced trauma. And so we want to make sure that that we're very clear, and that's why I really like having written information. And I don't know if there's something similar out there. Years ago, we wrote this, Violence Against Native Women is Not Traditional. It was a handbook that we gave to women when they came into shelter. Many women told me that it was their Bible, and they would sit and read it over and over and over. So if there's some kind of written information that, in addition to talking about guidelines, rules, regulations, whatever, that also can offer some insight and inspiration, that would be, I think it's nice to give women that, because again, depending on a woman's state of mind or what's going on that day, that she may or may not catch everything. After the paperwork's done, I don't know what many of your job titles are: case manager, advocate. I know there's been a lot of I guess some criticism about the whole case management program I worked in. They switched it to a care coordinator. But case management's a coordination of services to assure continuity, and advocacy is that we're actually representing the individual's needs and interests. I think hopefully you're doing a little bit of both. You're combining those two to be something really powerful and to be able to act as a good relative. So when we're looking at recovery, and I'm going to cruise through this so we can get to a few questions maybe, it's a process, right? And this is some of the things that people are going through in that process. So you can see it's quite an exhaustive list, from your body, exercise, nutrition, your mind, right? Resolving childhood wounds so they don't undermine self-regulation, that's a biggie. A lot of the research I looked at was saying that resolution of some of these childhood issues goes a long ways toward helping obtain sobriety, maintain it. Learning effective ways to manage stress, learning to process, to consciously shift feeling and thinking states. A lot of times in treatment they do this whole chart where so you can see how throughout a day you experience lots and lots and lots of different kinds of emotions. Developing outer resources, a strong relationship network, hobbies, social life, community. I think that's a really big one, to have realistic expectations, good boundaries, consciously maintain good habits. A lot of people have not had a lot of structure in their lives, especially if you grew up in an alcohol or drug-addicted home where there was lots of chaos. There's not been a lot of structure. Again, here's some more key traits of people maintaining sobriety. To live in the present. And I think that's one thing that we can do, is to help people live in the present. This is just a laundry list of therapeutic activities, and hopefully you have some incentives. again, if you can get people together into community, that's the ideal for me. We used to have quarterly get-togethers with our families, and it was really fun. You know, of course, we were rural, and we had an equine program. Kids would ride horses. We had a little farm, and it was lovely. Good food, some singing, some dancing. Of course, we got donations, but to nurture that sense of community, a sense of belonging, right? And I know that you can't make people, we can't have these mandatory or mandated activities, so it really is something where we're going to have to work hard to incentivize people so that they want to come, and maybe even ask people. And of course, transportation is always a biggie, but what would make you want to come? We used to have women say, do my laundry. Okay, so healing's a journey. There's no one-size-fits-all. There's no magic wand, right? It's about relationships and building those relationships. Here's some of the things just about us personally: patience, empathy, sensitivity, fortitude, support. A lot of the activities, again, depending on your level of comfort, you can go on Amazon. I used to use an anxiety workbook for teens, and I would just copy things out of it. And I liked it because the language is simple, and I thought it worked well with people. I had one young woman, I just gave her stuff every week because she asked me to. There's trauma-releasing exercises, just simple little, 3 minutes of exercises that you could do at home with your kids. They have pictures that shows you how to do them, and this guy actually developed that for third world countries where there was no access to mental health services. So if you go online, you can find lots and lots of things. I just want to end this is I was trying to end with an inspirational quote, and finally I found one that I'm actually quoting myself and Marlon Musso. The heart of our nation lies in the feminine. The recognition of the life-giving power of women is essential to all Native peoples as we work to reclaim the knowledge that will lead us to nonviolence within our families. Our connection with Mother Earth teaches us that all things are independent yet related. Life is about cooperation and helping each other as relatives. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. We have a couple questions. So one of them is, do you have an example or two you can share about how to talk to someone that you think is abusing substances, and what are the first suggestions you might offer that person?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Okay, so this, again, it's about relationships. So if you've built that relationship, and depending on the age difference, I think that will determine how direct or indirect you might need to be. I think a lot of times you can start with the I noticed, or this has happened, and what's going on, let's talk. So you want to try to set a stage where a person will feel comfortable just visiting with you about what's going on in their life, and try to figure out, do they see that as a problem? How severe of a problem is it? I mean, are we talking about you're going to need to report her to social services because her children were left alone because she was out binging, or a landlord's called you, if that's even possible in your programs, or you've heard through the moccasin telegraph. But I think even though people might get upset, I think people do appreciate a more direct approach, and that can be done very gently. What's going on? When was the last time you used? Are we talking about a relapse? So I guess, it's a tough conversation, but sometimes you just have to have it, and then you have to know that the person might get upset with you. And again, that's why you want to have that strong relationship, because they might get upset with you. But then it's just like when your kids get upset with you, or your niece, or your whoever, it's not going to be forever, most likely. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, because those are tough conversations, but you got to have it.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Karen. I know with the women that I've worked with over the years that having those tough conversations, one of the things for me has been to make sure that I also don't react when they're reacting. That as they're getting mad at me, I can't participate in the escalation of that. So I have to be real clear about what I'm communicating and being able to be real patient and listen deeply to what people are saying as well.
Right, and Vicki, I think excuse me, but I think you have to look at what the resources are in your community too. What is it that you could get her to, and what is it that she thinks she needs? So, are we talking about going to a ceremony or a sweat? Are we talking about heading straight for the alcohol and drug program? Are we talking about going to an AA meeting? And I think, those are things that working in a transitional housing, but then we want to try to facilitate. And then I think, the real work begins, and then is that consistent involvement and that consistent support that so many women don't have,
Mm-hmm.
We might be her person.
Right. So Karen, another question. Some women don't think they have a problem and don't want to do anything about their substance use. How would you address that?
Again, we're talking about how is it impacting her life and the life of her children? Again, and so depending on the severity of that, again, it's just having that conversation and approaching her. And this is what's going on. And then, like you said, Vicki, when she gets mad at you about it, to be able to sit there and to continue to have the conversation. And that maybe that initial conversation isn't going to lead her to say, oh, yeah, the light bulb came on, I have a problem. She's more likely to say, cuss you out, get upset with you. I had one where she called, she did not want me anymore. And after about 3 weeks, the therapist called me in and said, she's requesting that you go, whatever, because she'd figured out I was her person. I mean, there was nobody in the agency that had the time, or it was part of their duties, or, that could respond to her to the degree that I could. And so we made up. And, each time it facilitated a little growth for me, and it facilitated a little growth for her that, I need to work on this, or I need to do, so it's a process, and it's not like, you have the conversation and then she's going to, her happy face is going off to treatment and then the problem's solved. It's a very long process. We're talking about hanging in there with each other.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Karen. Are there other questions that people have? While we wait to see, I just want to let people know that all the webinars are recorded, and a couple weeks following the webinar, the recording will be archived on Redwind's website, which I posted up in the chat box, so you've got the website link on there. Karen, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Well, I just want to let people know, I want to put a little, I hope I'm not being inappropriate, Vicki, but chew me out later. I want to put a plug in for Brenda Hill Consulting and Indigenous Women's Justice Network in, I'm not sure, March or June. Hopefully all of you will be getting a notice that we're going to be hosting actually a 2-day workshop on this topic of substance use and domestic violence. So, and we'll be having some actual activities, trauma-informed activities that you can do with your families, the people you're serving, and we'll go more in depth about some of the drugs and whatnot. So I hope you'll look for that.
Yeah, so when you get ready to do that, you can send that to us, Karen, here at Redwin, and we can share it with our email list.
Oh, that'd be great, Vicki. Thank you. And I want to just encourage people, if we're done, Vicki, I wanted to just sing a quick little song because, you know, as Indigenous people, we're singers. We got to sing. And this is a song, it's called an encouragement song, and what it says is that we're asking the Creator, whoever that might be for you, to hear us, and that we have a need, and we're asking for help in getting that met, that we are suffering. So I always like to say it's comforting to know that we're not alone. And this is a song that my Mushke, my sister friend Tilly Black Bear, really would sing at all those tribal coalition meetings, and I think it's always so appropriate. So please know that all of you, you're always in my prayers, and I hope that I can that you will continue to pray for me and for us out here in the Dakotas, because you know we're having a pretty hard time right now. So anyway, it's been a pleasure to spend time with you. Vicki, again, I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Hey, hi, hey, hi. Hey, hi, hey, hi. Way, hi, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh. Way, hi, hey, hi. Way, hi, oh, hey, hey, oh. Hey, 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 ho. Wakantanka Ushimalaye Hemaka Kijeloyo. Hey, hey, hoi. Chanupa Kile. Hey, you ha. Oh, yeah, lo, yo, hey, oh, we chose on me, okay, we taki, oyase.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all so much for joining us today's webinar. And if you had multiple people at your location, please send your sign-in sheet back to us. And we have another webinar with Karen coming up November 17th on that Thursday from 1 to 2:30 Mountain Time, Substance Use and Domestic Violence, Policy and Operating Procedures. So we look forward to many of you joining us for that. And then following that webinar, our next one will be coming up January 12th, 2017, from 1 to 2:30 Mountain Time. And the title is Economic Advocacy to Strengthen Survivors' Long-Term Sustainability. And it's presented by myself, Victoria Ibanez. Thank you all, and thank you, Karen, for a very informative session. And it was really great hearing all of your knowledge and sharing that you had to offer us today. Thank you.
Hope we love.